Hello again, it's Cons, and we're going to have a quick look at the Rajang Armour set and see whether or not it's worth using. First things first, let's have a look at the set bonus. Mind's Eye at 2 parts and Protective Polish at 4. I'm going to be honest with you, they're both pretty garbage. Protective Polish is just a 2-slot decoration, as is Mind's Eye. You're really not gaining much by running 4 pieces of Rajang. Now, if Rajang happens to be a really good set, then the free Protective Polish is nice, especially because Rajang comes with speed sharpening. But just generally, there's never any value in running 4 points of an armor set just to get Protective Polish when you could just slot that in with a single 2-slot. So hopefully the armor set itself is good. We're off to a good start with the Headpiece. 2 points weakness exploit, a 4-slot and a 1-slot. It's quite reminiscent of Black Veil's piece, 2 peak performance, 4-slot, 1-slot, 2 sort of 2-slot skills, and then a 4-slot and a 1-slot. So I can imagine this piece getting some use for sure. Of course, there are a lot of sets that use other set bonuses, things like Master's Touch or Namiel Divinity, and in those cases you've got to weigh up the loss of skills and the swapping around of armor pieces. We'll look at Teo as an example. The thing about Teostra is the Headpiece is one of the good parts. Currently, when you're running Master's Touch with Teostra, you run the Headpiece, you run the arms, and you run the weights, and then with your chest you usually run like Brute Tiger X, and with the legs you usually run something like Garuga Legs. Well, I say something like Garuga Legs are just crazy. And the thing is, the head has decent skills in it. 2 crit eye and a 4-slot is good. 1 weakness exploit, 4-slot, 3-slot is nice. The waist has got a good number of decorations, so at least it's doing something. Now the problem is, if you want to run something like Black Veil's helmet, or in our case Rajang's helmet, on a set that requires Master's Touch, you have to no longer use the Headpiece. And so let's say you want to swap to the leg piece. Essentially what happens is you lose these 2 points of critical eye, and in exchange you gain 2 points of weakness exploit and a slot, if you compare the difference. But you then have to change your Garuga Legs, which is a 4-slot and 2 2-slots and 2 critical eye, into this garbage, which is basically nothing. And so essentially you're losing 4 points of critical eye, and you're losing 2 2-slots. And in exchange, you're not gaining a huge amount. So it's questionable at best depending on the set bonuses that you're using. But if you're not tied down to any particular set bonus, or your helmet is free, even with the set bonus, then this looks like a piece that can get some use for sure. A lot of these other pieces have resentment on them. Now, if you don't know, resentment is a skill where if you have sort of red health that can be recovered, then you gain an attack boost. It goes 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. Not particularly impressive compared to something like Peak Performance, where by level 3 you're already reaching plus 20 anyway. But it's still okay to have. I remember early on in Monster Hunter World's meta, we sort of saw people running resentment when they were fighting things in the Elder's Recess and then opting not to take a cold drink. You save time on the cold drink, and you also gain a bit of a damage boost, which is nice. That said, given the range of quite powerful pieces of armor that we have at the moment, I don't really imagine resentment sort of making its way back into the mainstream, especially because of how easy it is to activate rage mode now. If anything, if you were going to be activating one of these sort of 5-level skills, you'd be going for Agitator every time pretty much. Let me see if I can find it. Gotta be here somewhere. Here we go. The thing about Agitator is that by the time you reach level 5 on Agi, you're gaining 20 attack, which is basically the same, but you've also gained 10% affinity, and it's far easier to keep up and maintain. It really does depend on how valuable resentment becomes. I can't see it being used at all, but the speedrunning community are fairly creative, and maybe they'll come up with a niche case where some of these parts can get mixed in. But generally speaking, especially for a non-speedrun sense, the thing is, if you really wanted to run resentment, the gimmick of that requires you to be always taking damage, which is quite risky. Whereas with Peak Performance, you can gain basically the exact same attack boost, but with a gimmick that requires you to heal, which is generally far more sort of valuable and sustaining for a non-speedrun playstyle. So generally speaking, I'm not a fan of resentment. If resentment becomes handy, some of these pieces become good. But without it, for example, the arms are just pretty garbage. 1 resentment, 4-slot, 3-slot. In fact, Gold Rathian is 2 resentment, 4-slot, 2-slot, which is basically an upgrade. It's a bit of a side grade, but it's in most cases, if you do want resentment, it's just objectively better. So the arms are not anything to write home about. The only thing that would make these useful is if the set bonus was good, but unfortunately it's not. Similar with the legs, like the problem with the legs is your competition is Yan Garuga. Look at these bad boys. 2 critical eye, 4 slot, and 2 slots. Yeah, you just really can't compete with the Angaruga legs, unfortunately. Again, if resentment somehow became viable or useful, then maybe, but no. Critical eye is generally just better than attack boost, and just a really good skill in general. Plus, you've got the extra 2 slot, which is really nice for getting crit boost into your sets and things like that. Whereas these are just, I don't know, they're just not as good, unfortunately. Lastly, we have the waist piece. 1 weakness exploit, 4 slot, 3 slot. It's a reasonable piece of armor. There isn't much competition in terms of waists. However, the thing is, often enough your waist piece is just sort of a decoration slave for your set bonus. You know, you're running Namiel, or you're running Volcano, or you're running Teostra. You know, again, I'll go back to Master's Touch Teo. A 4 slot, a 2 slot, and a 1 slot, even if you forget the blast attack. Whereas here, you have a 4 slot and a 3 slot. You're really not losing all that much just by swapping over to Teostra. You're losing a few slots worth, but then you're gaining Master's Touch, of course. That said, this is probably one of the more useful pieces in the set. I can imagine the waist and the head getting mixed in somewhere, just because weakness exploit is generally so nice, and because they have reasonable slots on them. The rest, you could argue it hinges on whether or not people want to use resentment. I would argue nobody wants to use resentment, but you never know. We'll take a look at the alpha set quickly. The alpha helmet is really nice for anybody who hasn't gotten a handicraft plus deco yet, which is most of us. If you do have the handicraft plus deco, then the Rajang beta is just an objective improvement and more flexible. A lot of these pieces are like that. 2 speed sharpening, really not worth it, to be honest. Slightly better if you don't have optimal decos, but who's running speed sharpen anyway? This is probably worth using if you want handicraft on your set, Rajang alpha arms over Rajang beta arms, just because the 2 points of handicraft essentially take your 4 slot down to a 2 slot, and so you're getting a 4 slot or you're getting handicraft on a 2 slot, and generally handicraft on a 2 slot is more valuable than a single 4 slot. So potentially there's some improvement to be had here, but we've already talked about these arms and they're not particularly great to begin with. And even if you forget resentment, then 2 handy and a 2 slot is not very good compared to some of the other options. Just the Nergi arms sort of come to mind straight away. 2 agitator, attack boost, 4 slot, 1 slot. It's a really nice arm. The Rajang Alpha Coil is sort of a side grade over Rajang Beta Coil. If you have a handicraft decoration, you can throw that into here and you'll end up with weakness exploit, handy, and a 4 slot. Whereas here you have a 3 slot and a 1 slot. A 4 slot versus a 3 slot and a 1 slot. I mean, 3 in 1 is usually more flexible if you have the decorations you need. But it's not strictly always the case. For example, like Agi Plus. But yeah, it's more of a side grade. I can imagine these both being used if you want handicraft, especially. Then Alpha might be valuable to you, especially if you don't have the decorations for it. And lastly, the legs, upgrading from a 4 slot, giving yourself attack boost and dropping it down to a 2 slot. Again, kind of a side grade, but generally not particularly worthwhile, just because attack boost itself isn't a particularly great skill. And because of what we've talked about previously, you really don't want to be running this anyway. The Garuga legs are just too good to pass up. So yeah, overall, Rajang doesn't have a very good set bonus, unfortunately, which kind of hinders the armor set significantly, and the reliance on resentment, which isn't a particularly powerful skill, sort of holds it back. However, there are a couple of good pieces. The waist is okay, the helmet is quite nice. The alpha version of them are quite good, especially if you don't have many decorations. Even if you do have the decorations, the waist is more of a side grade, offering some more flexibility. The other piece is, if resentment becomes useful, or you can find a sort of meme build where it happens to be good for you, you know, you're going into the Elder's Recess and you don't want to bother using a cold drink, then maybe some of these are valuable, but even then, over most of the meta pieces, you're really not gaining much. But yeah, that's just my quick look at the Rajang armor set. Yeah, this could all be wrong. Obviously, watch the TA runner of your choice of your weapon to see what's best for you. But this is just sort of an overall look into the way I think about these armor sets, and you know, the logic that I use to judge them. And you can agree with it or disagree with it and come to your own conclusion based on sort of how you see these issues. Anyway, you have a lovely evening. Take it easy. Bye bye.